This is the world tapestry, and in America we have forgotten. We remember the powdered wigs, the stirring speeches, the musket fire ringing out against a cold April sky. We have built monuments to the ideas that forged a nation, but we have largely forgotten the very fuel that made it all possible. The daily bread of the American Revolution. The tastes and smells that would have been so familiar to a farmer, a merchant, a Minuteman, or even a founding father. This was a world without supermarkets, without freezers, without a single can on a shelf. Every meal was a testament to season, to skill, and to survival itself. So tonight we are stepping back through time. We are going to light the fire, dust off the handwritten receipts, and explore what it truly meant to eat in 1776. This isn't just about odd recipes or historical curiosity. This is about the visceral, tangible connection to the people who built this country. It's in the coarse grain of the bread they broke, the warmth of the small beer they shared, and the smoky haze of the hearth where every single thing was cooked. We will discover how global politics flavored their desserts, how economics sweetened their tea, and how a simple, inedible container called a coffin held an entire meal within it. This is the story of hunger, ingenuity, and the flavors of freedom. This is the world tapestry. The open hearth. Before a single ingredient could be touched, before a pot could be placed, the heart of the home had to be awakened. The open hearth was more than a fireplace. It was the engine of domestic life, a demanding and dangerous entity that required constant attention. A fire was rarely allowed to die completely, as restarting it was a laborious task. The heat it radiated was immense and uneven, and cooking before it was a physical ordeal of scorched faces and aching backs. Different temperatures were achieved not by dials, but by moving heavy cast iron pots and kettles closer to the roaring flames or further away into the cooler ashes, a delicate dance mastered through lifelong experience. This was the relentless, smoky, and essential ritual that began every single day and preceded every single meal in colonial America. And it was next to this radiating heat that a cook would begin her most important task, preparing a vessel that was meant not to be eaten, but to simply endure. Point 2. The mysterious pie coffin. In the lexicon of 1776, a pie was not just a dessert. It was a method of preservation, a means of transportation, and a marvel of culinary engineering. And its secret lay in its container, the coffin. This was a thick, sturdy crust made from flour, water, and perhaps a little fat, mixed into a durable, inedible dough. Its purpose was purely functional, to create a solid, sealed container that could protect its precious contents of meats, fats, and gravies from the contaminating ash and soot of the open hearth for hours on end. The coffin was a slow-cooking vessel that tenderized tough cuts of meat and allowed flavors to meld beautifully. When served, the top crust might be broken open and eaten, but the tough, often burnt base was typically discarded or given to the servants or children. It was a humble, practical beginning to a feast, a testament to a waste-not philosophy where even the container had a vital role to play. Once the sturdy coffin was prepared, it was time to fill it. And one of the most popular and surprising dishes was a chaotic masterpiece of textures and tastes. Point 3. Salmagundi, the first American salad bar. If you could open a colonial tavern menu, one dish would likely jump out for its sheer audacity: salmagundi. This was no simple side salad. It was a grand, chaotic arrangement, a centerpiece designed to showcase a host's prosperity and creativity. At its heart, salmagundi was a glorious, unpredictable mashup. It could include a base of leafy greens, topped with chunks of cooked meat like chicken or ham, anchovies, pickled herring, hard-boiled eggs, onions, grapes, and whatever else was on hand. The entire creation was then dramatically dressed with a pungent mixture of oil, vinegar, and spices. Every bite was a different experience: salty, sweet, sour, and savory. It was a dish of contrasts and abundance, reflecting the growing, though often precarious, prosperity of the colonies. It represented a world of trade, where spices from the Indies could meet apples from the orchard and meats from the farm, all on one single, wild plate. While salmagundi showcased worldly flavors, another common dish held a spice so valuable it was often used as currency. Point 4. Pepper cake, the spice that built a nation. We think of pepper as a humble tabletop condiment, but in 1776, it was a symbol of immense wealth and global reach. Black pepper, along with other spices from the East Indies, was a luxury commodity, its trade routes fiercely protected by empires. And this is what makes pepper cake so fascinating. This was a dense, molasses-sweetened gingerbread-like cake, loaded with black pepper and other precious spices like cinnamon, cloves, and mace. Baking one was a bold statement, a deliberate display of a family's access to capital and connection to international trade. Each slice was a paradox, a dessert that packed a surprising, warm heat, much like the revolutionary spirit itself. It was a taste of the wider world, a hint of the exoticism and economic ambition that fueled the colonies. To savor a piece of pepper cake was to taste the very commerce that Britain sought to control and the colonists sought to claim for themselves. This access to global goods was a luxury, for the colonial kitchen was overwhelmingly governed by a far more local and relentless master. The turning of the seasons. Point 5. A feast of seasons, eating without a calendar. Imagine a world without a single strawberry in December, without a green bean in March. The colonial diet was an intimate dance with the calendar of the sun and soil. What you ate was dictated entirely by what was in season, what had been successfully harvested, and what could be preserved through rudimentary means. Spring meant tender greens and the first asparagus. Summer was a glorious, fleeting abundance of berries, fresh peas, and beans. Autumn brought a frantic rush of harvesting, slaughtering, and preserving, salting meats, drying herbs, and storing root vegetables in cool cellars for the long, lean winter ahead. Winter itself was a monotonous parade of salted pork, hardened bread, and those very stored roots, making the first fresh greens of spring a cause for genuine celebration. This cyclical feast and famine created a deep, ingrained appreciation for abundance and a culinary creativity born of necessity, forcing cooks to make 100 different dishes from a limited pantry. It was a life deeply connected to the land, for to be disconnected was to risk hunger. This constant battle against scarcity, especially for travelers and soldiers, led to one of the most peculiar and vital foods of the era. Point 6. The portable soup, the original emergency rations. In an era before canned goods, how did you feed an army on the move or a ship's crew on a months-long voyage? The answer was a miraculous, if utterly bland, invention: portable soup. This was not a soup as we know it. It was the result of boiling down vast quantities of meat bones, cartilage, and vegetables for hours, even days, until all the collagen and gelatin were extracted. This concentrated broth was then poured into pans, allowed to set, and dried in a low oven or in the sun until it hardened into a translucent, rock-solid cake that could be stored for years. To reconstitute it, a chunk would be shaved off and boiled with water, creating a thin, nutritious, and deeply unsatisfying broth. It was a food of pure utility, devoid of pleasure, designed solely to sustain life where no other food could be carried. This simple, durable block was a staple in the knapsacks of continental soldiers, a testament to the grim, practical realities of revolution and exploration, where survival often trumped taste. While soldiers relied on these hardened bricks of sustenance, back home, another beverage was brewing a different kind of revolution. Point 7. The politics of tea, more than just a drink. In the years leading to 1776, a simple morning ritual became a powerful political act. Tea was more than a beverage. It was a symbol of British refinement, wealth, and, increasingly, oppression. The British East India Company held a monopoly on its import, and Parliament's taxes on it, like the 1773 Tea Act, were seen not as mere revenue bills but as a direct assault on colonial liberty and self-governance. Drinking tea meant complying with and funding a system many colonists grew to despise. This is why the boycott of tea became a widespread and powerful form of protest. Homespun Liberty tea, brewed from local herbs like mint, raspberry leaves, and sage, became a patriotic alternative. The act of forsaking the imported brew was a daily, personal declaration of resistance. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about destroying cargo, it was the explosive culmination of this simmering cultural war fought in countless colonial teacups, proving that the simplest daily habits can become the fuel for revolution. As tea fell from favor, another, more American drink sat bubbling in barrels in nearly every cellar, becoming the true lifeblood of the colonies. Point 8. The humble journey of the apple, America's first favorite fruit. The apple is so quintessentially American, yet its journey began as a seed from Europe. But in colonial hands, it became something new. Orchards were planted from seed, creating a stunning diversity of tart, sweet, and bitter apples, each with its purpose. While some were eaten fresh or baked, the apple's true destiny was in the cider press. Hard cider was the ubiquitous beverage of choice for all ages and classes. It was safer than often polluted water, nutritious, and relatively easy to produce. A farmer's wealth was sometimes measured by the number of barrels of cider in his cellar. It was consumed at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, even by children in a weaker form called ciderkin. From the well-tended orchards of gentlemen like William Byrd and Benjamin Franklin to the single tree by a homesteader's cabin, the apple was democracy in action. A humble fruit that provided sustenance, refreshment, and a small measure of independence, fermenting quietly into a symbol of American self-reliance. While apples grew in orchards, the colonial garden was a patchwork of now unfamiliar vegetables, many of which have vanished from our plates only to return as expensive delicacies. Point 9. Common vegetables now considered gourmet. Walk through a modern farmer's market and you'll see heirloom vegetables sold at a premium. In 1776, these were not specialty items. They were the common, everyday backbone of the diet, grown in every kitchen garden. Salsify, a root vegetable with a subtle oyster-like flavor, was a staple for boiling and mashing. Skirret, a sweet, fibrous root, was grown for its edible stalks. Good King Henry was a leafy green used like spinach. These plants, alongside parsnips, turnips, and a vast array of beans, were chosen for their hardiness and storage capability, not their novelty. Their gradual disappearance from our diets is a story of agricultural industrialization favoring uniformity over diversity. That we now seek out these forgotten vegetables and pay a high price for them is a quiet irony, a testament to how far we've strayed from the seasonal, local abundance that was once simply called supper. For a hot meal they didn't have to cook themselves, colonists would head to a bustling center of news, food, and community, the tavern. Point 10. The unspoken rules of the tavern meal. After a long day on the rough roads of the colonies, a tavern was more than a place to drink, it was a sanctuary. But a meal here operated under a set of customs vastly different from our modern restaurant experience. There was no menu. You ate what the innkeeper's wife had prepared that day, typically a single, large potage or stew. There were no individual tables. Travelers, often strangers, were seated together at a long communal table. The meal itself was served in a large shared trencher, a wooden platter, from which everyone would eat, often with their own personal knife and spoon. This enforced intimacy was not just practical, it was a vital social ritual. It was where news was exchanged, opinions were debated, and alliances were formed over a shared loaf of bread and a common bowl. The tavern meal was a microcosm of colonial society, communal, pragmatic, and often rowdy, a world where personal space was sacrificed for the warmth of fellowship and the latest gossip. While travelers shared a trencher, the very youngest colonists were nourished by a simple, bland porridge that reflected the precariousness of early life. Point 11. The surprisingly bland palate of a colonial child. In an era of strong, pungent flavors and heavily salted meats, the first foods of a colonial child were notably, and purposefully, plain. The standard weaning food was pap, a simple mixture of breadcrumbs or flour cooked in water or milk, sometimes sweetened with a tiny bit of honey or molasses if the family could afford it. This bland gruel was practical. It was easy for a toothless infant to swallow and gentle on a delicate stomach. But it also reveals a stark reality. Childhood was a perilous time, and diet was directly linked to survival. Spices and rich foods were believed to be too heating or complex for a child's fragile constitution. This simple, functional food was the first step into a world where nourishment was never taken for granted. A child's survival on this basic diet was a hopeful sign, a small victory in a life that would later be filled with the robust, challenging flavors of the adult world. For those adults at a fancy dinner, however, robust flavors weren't always enough. Culinary deception was often required to display one's skill and wealth. Point 12. The art of the made dish. Culinary deception. In wealthy households, dining was theater. Among the upper classes, a cook's skill was often measured by her ability to execute a made dish, an elaborate creation designed to astonish and delight guests. This was the peak of fashionable 18th century cuisine, and it often involved delicious deception. A skilled cook could make a humble calf's head taste like a variety of different fowl. Meat was painstakingly chopped, seasoned, reformed, and boiled or baked to resemble something entirely new and exotic. One popular dish, ragout of pig's ears, aimed to transform a common, cheap ingredient into a delicacy. This wasn't just about trickery, it was a display of artistry, control over ingredients, and the host's refined taste. It showed that one's kitchen was not merely a place of subsistence but a studio for creating edible illusions, proving that even in a world of straightforward hunger, there was a place for culinary flair and playful extravagance. While the wealthy dined on illusions, the sweetener in their desserts was tied to a very real and bitter economic reality that affected every colonist. Point 13. The Molasses Act. The sweetener that fueled a revolution. It is almost impossible to overstate the importance of molasses in colonial America. This thick, dark, sweet syrup was the lifeblood of the economy and the kitchen. It was the primary sweetener for everything from baked beans and gingerbread to the morning porridge, as refined white sugar was an expensive luxury. But its significance ran even deeper. New England merchants built a thriving triangular trade, rum to Africa, enslaved people to the West Indies, and molasses back to the colonies to be distilled into more rum. When Parliament passed the Molasses Act of 1733, followed by the Sugar Act of 1764, it wasn't just taxing a commodity, it was attempting to cripple an entire colonial industry and force dependence on British West Indian products. Widespread smuggling of molasses became an act of economic defiance. This sticky, humble syrup, flowing into every pantry and distillery, thus became intertwined with the colony's economic survival, their moral compromises, and their growing thirst for independence from British control. The production of this rum and the preparation of these meals required long hours of work that often stretched well past sunset, relying on a light source that was itself a precious and laborious commodity. Point 14. The labor of light. Tallow dips and whale oil. We take the simple flick of a light switch for granted, but in the colonial home, extending the day past sunset was a costly, dim, and smoky affair. The most common light source was the tallow dip, a reed or linen thread repeatedly dipped in rendered animal fat, tallow, and allowed to harden. These dips sputtered, produced a foul odor, and gave off a feeble, greasy light. For the more affluent, there was whale oil, burned in a special lamp with a glass chimney. This was a clearer, brighter light, but it was expensive and tied to the dangerous whaling industry. Both options required constant maintenance, trimming wicks, cleaning chimneys, and replenishing fuel. This labor of light meant that evening chores like sewing, reading, or repairing tools were done in a pool of shadows. It dictated the rhythm of life, pushing families to rise with the sun and retreat with its setting, making the winter months a long, dark struggle against the night. While light was a struggle, procuring a truly spectacular ingredient for a feast could be a monumental task, leading to a curious culinary craze that swept through the dining rooms of the elite. Point 15. The curious case of amphibious meat, turtle mania. For a truly unforgettable feast, nothing made a statement like a sea turtle. In the mid-18th century, turtle mania captivated the American and British elite. Live sea turtles, primarily green sea turtles, were captured in the Caribbean, stored on their backs in the holds of ships, and transported north to be kept alive in tavern cellars until a lavish dinner was planned. The entire animal was used in an extravagant soup, a massive undertaking that could feed dozens. The rich fat, green-colored callipee and red-colored calapash were considered particular delicacies. Serving turtle was the ultimate display of wealth, global connection, and power over nature. It was a taste of the exotic, a symbol of status that separated the colonial upper class from the common folk who dined on salt pork and potatoes. This extravagance highlights the vast economic divides within colonial society, where one man's celebrated delicacy was utterly unknown to another. For the common folk, however, the most common beverage wasn't an exotic soup but a weak, low-alcohol beer that was consumed like water. Point 16. Small beer, the safest thing to drink. In a time when water sources were often contaminated and unsafe, the most common beverage on the colonial table, for adults and children alike, was beer. But not the strong Irish we know today. The true staple was small beer, a second brewing from the same grains used to make a stronger ale. This process extracted the last of the fermentable sugars, resulting in a very low alcohol, slightly malty, and mildly hopped drink. Its primary purpose was not intoxication but hydration. The boiling process during brewing killed harmful bacteria, making it far safer than pond or well water. It was consumed throughout the day, from the morning meal to the evening supper, providing crucial calories and nutrients. This weak brew was a fundamental safeguard of public health, a humble but essential technology that allowed communities to thrive. The constant consumption of small beer illustrates a world where survival depended on such ingenious, everyday adaptations to a dangerous environment. This beer, like most meals, was often consumed from a vessel that was the very embodiment of the colonial waste not, want not ethos. Point 17. The trencher, the plate you could eat or reuse. Before the widespread use of wooden or pewter plates, many colonists, especially those of modest means, ate from a trencher. This was a fundamental piece of dinnerware, but it wasn't ceramic or metal. A trencher was a thick, slightly hollowed-out slab of stale, coarse-grained bread, typically made from rye or barley. The meal, stew, roasted meat, vegetables, was served directly onto this edible plate. At the end of the meal, the diner would eat the trencher, now soaked with gravies and juices, or if they were full, give it to a child, a servant, or toss it to the dogs. Nothing was wasted. In more affluent settings, a wooden trencher might be used, but the principle remained. It was often a square, shared board between two people. This simple object speaks volumes about the period's humility and resourcefulness, reminding us that for many, the line between dinner and dinnerware was deliciously blurred. The coarse flour for that bread trencher began its journey at the community's loud, dusty, and indispensable hub, the gristmill. Point 18. The gristmill, the community's most important building. The steady, rhythmic thumping of a gristmill's water wheel was the sound of community survival. Farmers from miles around would haul their sacks of grain, rye, corn, wheat, to this essential local enterprise. The miller, a respected and often powerful figure, would grind the grain between massive millstones, taking a portion called the miller's toll as his payment. This was not just a transaction, it was the vital link between the raw product of the field and the finished staple of the table. The mill was a place of news and gossip, where farmers waited and talked politics and crop prices. Its operation was so critical that it was often one of the first structures built in a new settlement and was frequently protected during conflicts. The grist mill was the noisy, flour-dusted heart of the colonial economy, transforming individual harvests into the communal stuff of life. Once the flour was home, a colonial cook would turn to her most precious kitchen document, a set of instructions that required knowledge and intuition to decipher. Point 19. The receipt, a recipe without measurements or temperatures. A colonial cook did not follow a recipe as we know it today. She followed a receipt. These were handwritten instructions, often passed down through generations or shared among neighbors, and they were famously cryptic. A receipt might call for a fistful of flour, a knob of butter the size of a walnut, or instruct one to bake in a quick oven until done. There were no precise temperatures, standardized measuring cups, or exact times. Success depended on a cook's accumulated experience, her senses, and her intimate knowledge of her own hearth's unique personality. She knew what a moderate oven felt like by holding her hand inside it and judged consistency by sight and touch. These receipts were less a rigid guide and more a trusted reminder, a starting point for a culinary conversation between the cook, her ingredients, and her fire. This oral and intuitive tradition ensured that the true art of cooking remained a lived skill, not just a written instruction, preserving a world of knowledge that lived in the hands and memory of the cook herself. And so, as we step back from the hearth and look at our own modern tables, we are left to wonder, what truly remains of this vast culinary world? What quiet legacy did these cooks leave on our plates? Point 20. The legacy on our plates. What truly survived? The dramatic, labor-intensive centerpieces of the colonial era, the massive turtle feasts, the elaborate made dishes, have largely faded into history. But the true, enduring legacy of 1776 is not in the extravagant, but in the humble and the resilient. It is in the Thanksgiving succotash, a Native American dish eagerly adopted by colonists. It is in the slow-simmered baked beans, sweetened with molasses and enriched with salt pork, a direct descendant of the Puritan Sabbath meal. It is in the hearty stews, the roasted meats, the apple pies, and the simple, robust breads. These dishes survived because they were practical, nourishing, and deeply satisfying. They represent not the theater of dining, but its heart. They are the foods that sustained families through long winters and hard wars, the flavors of perseverance and simplicity. They are the quiet, unassuming threads that connect our modern meals to the courage, ingenuity, and resilience of those who first dreamed of an independent America. And so, we close the ledger on our colonial meal. We've banked the fire and set aside the receipts. We've tasted the past, not as a distant story, but as a tangible, smoky, and complex reality. The world tapestry from 1776 is built not just of ideas and documents, but of coarse grain, hard cider, molasses-sweetened dreams, and the unwavering heat of the hearth. It's a reminder that history is lived in the daily acts of sustenance, in the shared trencher, and in the quiet satisfaction of a meal earned by hard labor. If you enjoyed this journey back to the flavors that built a nation, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Tap the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the world tapestry. Until next time.